Okay, so you know that feeling, right? That moment at work when you have to disagree with someone.
Oh, yeah.
It's like walking on eggshells.
It can be a total minefield.
Exactly. But what if we told you that disagreement, when it's done right, could actually be a superpower?
Like a secret weapon almost.
Totally. And that's what we are diving into today. We're going deep into this business English podcast, all about turning those dreaded disagreements into something that actually works for you.
I mean, disagreements, let's face it, they happen everywhere. In any workplace, you can't escape them. But here's the thing. Most people never learn how to do them well.
Right. And this podcast is packed with useful tips, like really specific techniques that anyone can use, no matter what your job is or what industry you're in. Like, for example, they talked about using these diplomatic phrases.
I love that. Diplomatic phrases. Because they really work. They acknowledge the other person's idea, but they also let you kind of slip your own point of view in there too.
Exactly. Instead of building walls, you're building a bridge.
Perfect analogy.
And they had a bunch of examples like how to disagree with your boss about a timeline. Say they give you this crazy, unrealistic deadline.
We've all been there.
Right. Instead of just saying, no way, which, let's be honest, is not going to get you very far.
Not at all.
You could try saying something like, I really appreciate that you're aiming high with this deadline, but based on what we have going on right now, I'd love to see if we can maybe adjust some things so we can make this work.
Much better.
You're not just shooting down the idea, you're offering a solution and you're working together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's something you can use with clients, colleagues, even with the CEO. It's about disagreeing in a way that makes everyone feel respected and heard.
And it actually leads to a better result in the end.
Absolutely.
Another thing they talked about that really got me thinking was the tone of voice. They had this really cool analogy about your voice being like an instrument in an orchestra.
Oh, I like that. Because
Yeah.
it's so true.
Yeah.
The way you say something is just as important as the words you actually use.
Totally. And I think a lot of people don't even realize how their tone changes when they start to feel defensive or like they're being challenged.
It definitely happens. Have you noticed how your voice changes?
Oh, yeah. I get all high-pitched, for sure.
Happens to the best of us. It's a totally natural reaction. When we feel threatened, we tend to speak faster and higher, and it makes us sound, well, less confident, even a little aggressive sometimes.
Yeah.
The podcast had this great tip, though. They said try consciously lowering your pitch when you disagree.
Interesting.
It's a really simple trick, but it makes you sound more in control. And when you sound in control, people are more likely to listen to what you're saying.
That makes sense. They also talked about something called tone modulation, specifically for virtual meetings.
Oh, right, because online we don't have those body language cues to help us out.
Exactly. So how we use our voice becomes even more important to get our meaning across and connect with people.
Think about it this way. Your tone of voice is sending these hidden signals about your attitude and emotions.
Like secret messages.
Kind of, and they can make a big difference in how people react to what you're saying. For example, try pausing for just a second before you disagree. It gives people a moment to process things you know. It makes them more open to hearing what you have to say.
It's like pressing the reset button on the conversation.
I like that, a
Yeah.
reset button. And these tiny little shifts in tone can totally change how your message is received, especially online where we don't have all those visual cues to help us out.
Now, this part really clicked for me. They talked about this method called BUILD, and it stands for Bridge, Understand, Illuminate, Lead, and Deliver. And instead of just saying no to an idea, you use this framework to actually come up with a different solution.
I love the build method. The whole point is to move away from saying no and move toward solving problems together. Let's say you're in a meeting and your team is talking about this new marketing campaign. And you have some serious doubts, but you don't want to just be a negative Nancy.
Okay, so how would you use BUILD in that situation?
First, you would bridge. You start by finding something positive about the idea, something you actually like. So you could say, I really like the creative energy behind this campaign, and I especially love mention something specific.
Got it. So you're starting off on a positive note, not jumping right into criticism.
Exactly. Then you move to understand. That's where you show you've been listening by kind of summarizing their idea. You could say, so it sounds like our main goal here is to reach a younger audience and get people talking about our brand.
So you're making sure everyone is on the same page before you bring up your alternative.
Right. Now comes the illuminate part. This is where you gently point out some potential problems or things that might not work so well. You could say, based on what we've seen in past campaigns, I'm not sure this approach will be cost effective. In our experience, targeting a slightly older audience with a more specific message has given us a better return on investment.
So you're not just saying no, you're presenting some data and facts to support your concerns.
Exactly. Then you lead by offering a different solution. You could say, maybe we could build on this idea and try a two-pronged approach. Keep some focus on the younger audience, but also use some of our budget to target a more mature audience with a message that's just for them.
So you're taking their idea and making it better instead of totally rejecting it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And finally, you deliver by explaining the next steps. You could say, I'd be happy to put together a new budget and a revised plan with these changes. Would everyone be open to taking a look at that next week?
That's really cool. By using Build, you've turned a potential conflict into a way for the whole team to work together and come up with something even better. Like disagreement can actually lead to innovation.
Exactly. That's the beauty of this approach. You're taking something that could be negative and turning it into a process where everyone wins.
And it's a skill that anyone can learn and use.
Absolutely. And the more you use it, the better you get at it. It's like any skill you know. The more you practice, the more natural it feels. And the payoff is huge.
What I really like is that this isn't just some theory, it's an actual framework with steps you can use in your daily work.
Exactly. And the coolest part, the more you practice these techniques, the better you'll become at disagreeing. Like anything else in life, it takes time and effort, but it's totally worth it.
It's like a superpower you can develop. Now, the podcast also talked about how culture plays a role in how we disagree, and that was super insightful. It's crazy how disagreeing, which seems so simple, can get super complicated when you bring a culture into it.
It's true. We all kind of assume that communication is the same everywhere you go.
Right.
But how we communicate, our style, is really shaped by our culture, where we come from, all that.
Yeah.
Like what might seem totally normal and assertive in one culture could be like, whoa, way too aggressive in another.
Totally. The podcast had the story about an American executive who almost lost a huge deal in Singapore because she was just too direct when she disagreed with something.
Ooh.
Yeah, and it turns out that in a lot of Asian cultures, coming right out and disagreeing is seen as disrespectful. Almost like you're attacking them.
Yeah, it can be a big no-no.
It really made me think about how crucial it is to be aware of these cultural differences, especially when you're working with people from all over the world.
It's not just about knowing the rules,
Yeah.
right? Like, okay, in Japan you do this, and in France you do that.
Yeah.
You have to actually develop what they call cultural fluency. You have to really understand all those subtle differences in how people communicate.
So it's more than just knowing the facts.
Way more. You have to understand things like hierarchy, how direct people are, and this thing called saving face.
Saving face. What's that?
Okay, so imagine you're working on a project with a team in Japan,
Okay.
and you need to disagree with your counterpart there. In a lot of Western cultures, it's totally fine to just say, hey, I disagree, here's why.
Right, just be straightforward.
But in a culture that values harmony and respecting your elders, you can't just be blunt.
Got it. So how would you handle that?
Instead of directly disagreeing, you could ask some questions that kind of hint at the problems you see. For example, you could say, I'm really interested to understand your perspective on this. Could you tell me more about how you think this will impact? Mention a potential problem.
So you're kind of leading them to see the issue without directly confronting them.
Exactly. You're expressing your disagreement, but you're doing it in a way that keeps the relationship strong and doesn't make anyone feel embarrassed.
It's all about being tactful.
Exactly. And this whole saving face thing, it's a big deal in tons of cultures around the world.
Huh.
It means understanding that sometimes disagreeing can feel like a personal attack, so you have to find ways to protect everyone's dignity and respect.
That makes a lot of sense. The podcast also talked about silence and how that can be interpreted differently depending on the culture.
Oh yeah, that's a fascinating one.
In some cultures, pausing after someone speaks is like a sign of respect, like you're giving them time to think.
Right.
But in other cultures, it can mean that you're not happy or you disagree.
It's wild how even not saying anything can mean totally different things.
Right, so you have to pay extra attention to those non-verbal cues.
For sure. When you're working with people from different cultures, you got to pay attention to body language, tone of voice, even those little silences.
It's like a whole other language.
It is. And if you can learn it, you can avoid a lot of misunderstandings and build really strong relationships with your colleagues all over the world.
So we've talked about how important it is to understand cultural differences, but let's get practical now.
Good.
The podcast had a ton of really actionable advice on how to get better at disagreeing no matter what the situation is. They even had a whole section on practicing disagreement. I thought that was so cool.
It's true. Most of us think communication is just something we naturally know how to do.
Yeah, like we're born knowing how to talk.
But disagreeing, well, it's a skill.
Mm-hmm.
Just like playing an instrument or learning a new language. You have to practice it. And the more you practice, the more confident and fluent you become.
They had this idea called the low stakes ladder, which is basically starting small with your disagreeing practice.
Love that.
Like trying it out in situations where it doesn't really matter that much before you go and have that big disagreement with your boss,
Exactly. It's a brilliant way to build your confidence. So maybe you start by disagreeing with a close colleague during a brainstorming session.
Yeah.
Something casual.
Yeah.
Or you try it out in a meeting where the stakes aren't so high.
Yeah.
The point is to get comfortable in a safe environment where you can experiment without worrying about making a big mistake.
And then you can work your way up to those bigger, tougher conversations.
Exactly. They even had this funny story about a senior executive who practiced her disagreement skills with her teenage kids.
Oh no, that's brave.
Right. But her point was, if you can calmly disagree with a teenager about screen time, you could probably handle anything at work.
I can only imagine. So it's about taking those skills and using them everywhere in your life.
Exactly. It's all connected. The same things that help you disagree at work can help you with your family, your friends, even strangers.
They also talked about this cool technique called triple perspective practice. So you take a real situation from work and you practice how you'd handle it from 3 different points of view. First, you're the person who's disagreeing. Then you're the person being disagreed with. And finally, you're just an observer watching the whole thing go down.
I love that. It makes you really think about how other people are seeing the situation.
Right. You develop empathy, which is so important. You learn to anticipate how people might react, and you can craft your message in a way that actually makes sense to them.
It's like taking a step back and seeing the bigger picture.
And for those of us who are always on video calls, they suggested recording yourself during a meeting and then watching it back, like cringe. But you can really see how you come across,
Yeah.
your tone, body language, all of it.
It's like having an instant replay for your communication skills. We all have these little habits and things we do without realizing it.
Yeah.
And this technique can help you spot them and fix them.
And finally, for anyone who's feeling really brave, they suggested finding a disagreement buddy.
Like a workout buddy, but for disagreeing.
Exactly. So it's a trusted colleague or a mentor, someone who can give you honest feedback on how you're doing.
It's so helpful to have someone else's perspective because they can see things you might miss. They can help you figure out what you're doing well and where you can improve.
Like having a coach in your corner.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, even when we try our best, we all make mistakes, right?
Oh.
And the podcast talked about some common communication traps that can mess things up even when you have the best intentions.
Oh, yeah. They had this list of what they called career torpedo phrases, which are these little sayings that sound harmless, but actually they make you sound passive-aggressive or even rude.
Like, with all due respect.
Ooh, yeah, that's a classic. Or actually.
It's like a red flag. These phrases might seem small,
Yeah.
but they can put people on the defensive right away and make them less likely to listen to what you're saying.
They also talked about emotional leakage, which is when you're trying to sound calm and professional, but your frustration is leaking out in your tone.
Oh, I've been there. It's so easy to let your emotions get the better of you, especially when things get heated.
Right. But that emotional leakage, it can really damage your credibility, and it can make other people react defensively too.
It's like a chain reaction of negativity.
And then there are those nonverbal cues we talked about earlier, like rolling your eyes, sighing dramatically, or crossing your arms. Especially on video calls, those can be really obvious.
It's amazing how much those little things can communicate. Sometimes they say even more than your words.
They can totally undermine what you're trying to say.
For sure. And the podcast also pointed out how important it is to choose the right moment to disagree. Like bringing up a controversial topic right before a big deadline or at the end of a long day is probably not going to end well.
Nope. Bad timing.
Timing is everything.
Yeah.
If you can be sensitive to what's going on around you and how everyone is feeling, you're much more likely to have a productive conversation.
Speaking of context, they also talked about choosing the right audience for your disagreement. Like, do you really need to hit reply all to that email with your critique?
Sometimes it's better to have a private conversation instead of making it a public debate.
Right. Keep it contained.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By being strategic about who you talk to, you can avoid unnecessary drama and conflict. And they had this funny story about a manager who tried to use humor to lighten up a disagreement with his Japanese colleagues.
Oh no, I can see where this is going.
He thought he was being lighthearted, but it actually made everyone super uncomfortable.
Oof. Cultural differences strike again.
It just goes to show you that even humor can be tricky, especially when you're dealing with different cultures.
What might seem funny to you could be totally offensive to someone else.
Exactly. One of my favorite tips from the podcast was the screenshot test.
What's that?
So before you send that snarky email or that passive-aggressive Slack message, imagine it being screenshotted and shared with everyone. Would you still be okay with it?
Oh man, that's a good one. I'm definitely going to use that.
It's a great way to pause and think before you hit send. Remember, in the digital world, our words can live forever.
So true. And they warned against this thing called the solution sprint, which is that urge to jump in and fix things before you've really understood the problem.
Ah, yes. We all know that person, the one who always has the answer before you've even finished explaining the problem.
Right. It's so tempting to want to be the hero and have all the solutions.
It is. But sometimes the best thing you can do is just listen. Ask questions. Make sure you really understand the situation before you start offering solutions.
They had this story about an engineer who was so eager to fix this technical issue that he interrupted his colleague while they were still talking and offered the solution. And it turned out he hadn't even grasped the whole problem yet, and his solution would have actually made things worse.
Yikes.
It just shows how important it is to listen actively and really understand the other person's point of view before you jump in with your own ideas.
Sometimes the best solutions come from working together and really understanding each other.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the psychology of communication to all these cultural differences. We've learned practical techniques for disagreeing effectively and talked about all those common mistakes that can trip us up. As we move into the final part of our deep dive, I'm curious what's been the most valuable thing you've taken away from this podcast so far?
For me, the biggest takeaway is that disagreeing when you do it thoughtfully can actually help you grow and come up with new ideas. It's not about avoiding conflict altogether. It's about knowing how to have those tough conversations in a way that actually makes things better.
I'm totally with you on that. And this podcast really emphasized how we need to adapt our skills for this digital world we live in. Like, so much of our communication happens online now. They even had a name for it: digital diplomacy.
I like that. Digital diplomacy. It makes sense though, right?
Yeah.
We're emailing, messaging, video calling all the time.
Constantly. But it's easy to forget that online communication comes with its own set of challenges.
Yeah, like things can get lost in translation. Exactly. The basic principles of communication, they're still the same. But online, those little nuances of tone and timing, they can get blown way out of proportion. Like the podcast had this example of a tech lead who almost tanked a whole project with a single emoji.
Oh no, what happened?
He thought he was just being lighthearted, but his colleague thought he was being dismissive and unprofessional.
Ouch. Emojis can be dangerous.
Right, it shows how those tiny little digital cues can have a huge impact. And without body language and facial expressions, it's so easy for misunderstandings to happen.
So how do we avoid those kinds of digital disasters?
Well, the podcast talked about understanding this thing called the digital tone matrix. It's basically recognizing that different online platforms, they require different communication styles.
Okay, so break that down for me. What are some things we need to keep in mind when we're navigating this digital tone matrix?
Okay, so email, for example, usually needs a more formal approach. Like, you want to be clear and concise and sound professional. Think of it like writing a letter, not a text message.
Got it. So what about those instant messaging platforms like Slack or Teams? Those are more casual, right?
Definitely. They're way more conversational. But you still have to be aware of who you're talking to in the situation. Humor, for example. It can be hard to get right in writing, so use it carefully.
And then there are video calls. Those feel like a whole other level of stress.
Oh, I know. It's like you're always on stage making sure your face and body language are sending the right message.
Right. It's exhausting.
The podcast suggested this thing called visual validation, which basically means using those visual cues to make your message stronger, so people really get what you mean.
Okay, so what are some practical tips for this visual validation thing?
First of all, posture. Sit up straight, look at the camera, and try not to fidget too much.
It's like my mom is back there reminding me to have good manners.
It's true. But those basic rules of etiquette, they're even more important online. Also, use your facial expressions to show that you're listening and engaged. Nod when you agree, tilt your head when you're really paying attention, and smile when it's appropriate.
And what about those awkward silences? Those feel 10 times worse on video calls.
Don't be afraid of a little silence. It's normal to pause and collect your thoughts. But if it starts to feel weird, you can always say something like, just thinking this through.
Right. That helps. The podcast also had some good advice for handling disagreements in emails. They talked about this CLEAR method for writing emails that are less likely to be misunderstood.
Oh yeah, CLEAR. It stands for Context, Logic, Evidence, Alternative, and Request. It's a really good way to structure your emails so they are clear, concise, and persuasive.
Okay, let's try it out. Let's say I need to disagree with a colleague about their plan for a project. How would I use CLEAR to write that email?
First, you give them context. Briefly explain the situation and acknowledge their perspective. You could say something like, I've been thinking about your proposed approach for the project name. I really appreciate your ideas about mention something specific.
So you start by setting the stage and showing respect.
Exactly. Then you present your logic. Explain your reasoning in a calm and objective way. You might say, based on my experience with similar projects, I'm worried that explain your specific concern could lead to potential problems.
So you're stating your disagreement, but focusing on the issue, not the person.
Exactly. Then you need to give them some evidence. Back up your concerns with some facts. You could say, for example, on the past project we ran into, give a specific example, and that resulted in describe the negative outcome.
So it's not just your opinion, you have proof.
Exactly. Now it's time to offer a different solution. You could say, maybe we could suggest an alternative approach. This would help us to explain the benefits.
So you're not just complaining, you're giving them a way to fix things.
Exactly.
Yeah?
And finally, you clearly state your request. You might say, would you be open to talking about this more? I'm free tomorrow afternoon to brainstorm some other ideas.
That's great. Using CLEAR, you've disagreed with them in a way that's respectful, professional, and you've given them a clear path forward.
It's a super useful tool for those tricky email situations.
Now, the podcast also had some good tips for avoiding those digital communication blunders that we all make sometimes.
Accidentally hitting reply all.
Oh, yeah. Before you click that button, ask yourself, does everyone really need to see this?
Good point. Sometimes a private message or a phone call is a much better way to handle things, especially if it's a sensitive topic or could cause unnecessary drama.
And they also talked about how dangerous it can be to send emails or messages late at night when you're feeling emotional.
Oh, I'm so guilty of that. It's so easy to fire off a quick response when you're feeling angry or frustrated.
I know. But it's usually better to wait until you've calmed down and had a chance to think things through.
They called it digital timing, which I think is a great way to think about it. Online, you don't have those subtle cues like tone of voice and body language to help you get your message across.
Right. It's easy to be misunderstood. So that screenshot test they talked about, that's a good one.
Oh yeah, that's a lifesaver. Before you send anything, imagine it being screenshotted and shared with everyone. Would you still feel good about it?
That's a great way to check yourself and make sure you're being professional and respectful. So we've learned a lot about disagreeing in this deep dive. What are your final thoughts?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that disagreement, it's normal. It's part of life, and especially in the workplace. But it doesn't have to be a bad thing. If we approach it with skill and the right intentions, it can actually make our relationship stronger and help us come up with better solutions.
Absolutely. We've learned so many practical techniques and strategies today, everything from diplomatic phrases and cultural fluency to navigating the wild world of digital communication. It's a good reminder that communication, it's a skill that we have to keep working on and improving. And you know what? I think we all have the power to turn those moments of conflict into opportunities for collaboration and growth.
I love that. And it all starts with recognizing that disagreeing can be valuable and then committing to becoming better communicators. So go out there and disagree well.
That's it for this deep dive. We hope you found these insights helpful. And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of communication.